The Shaping of Gondor, Part 5, The Line of Tarandor. Chapter 2, Telumehtar Umbardacil. The profound peace that the people of the Seven Heartlands had enjoyed throughout Tarandor's long reign seems to have broken like a morning fog with his death, and scarcely was the latter entombed in Rath Dinan than the Umbardrim launched an incursion across the Harnen and into the lands of Harondor. The plague had, as we have seen, afflicted Umbar and her adjacent regions just as grievously as it had Gondor, and it had taken the corsairs a century and a half to recover to the point of being able to offer battle. However, it was the good fortune of Gondor that she was so much the stronger and more populous of the two lands preceding the pestilence that even now, in her weakened state, she could still face Umbar at an advantage. Such thoughts may well have been in the mind of Telumehtar, son and heir of Tarandor, when he marched south to deal with the invaders. As it happened, Telumehtar was a supremely martial and stern man, as warlike as his father had been peaceable. He was large, fierce, broad-shouldered, and red-bearded. Few dared to cross his will or gainsay his honor. Thus, although the occupying Umbardrim were repeatedly defeated and eventually in 802 driven back across the Harnen with many losses, the king was not satisfied with that. Wherefore should Gondor be forever at the mercy of these treacherous brigands? Had not his ancestor Ernil the Seafarer once humbled and conquered Umbar in short order? This ambition fixed firmly in his own counsels, and disregarding the reality of Gondor's relative depletion and poverty in comparison with the kingdom of Ernil's time, he determinedly made ready to go to war. By 1810 he was ready, and as once Ernil had done, he fell upon the corsairs like a furious hurricane out of the bay of Belfalas. The Umbardrim were caught almost completely by surprise, for no proclamation of war had been issued from Minas Tirith, and few defences had been readied. This advantage of speed carried the day, for the attack fell in the dead of night, and the walls were soon breached with hooks and ladders. The city fell within hours, with the corsairs barely being able to put up any resistance to speak of. To repay the Umbardrim for the treacherous sack of Pelargir and the slaying of King Menardil 176 years earlier, Telumehtar proceeded to turn his soldiers loose on the inhabitants of the haven, and thousands, including many women and children, were mercilessly slaughtered before the grim eyes of the king. It is said that ere the Gondorians' avenging fury was spent, the bite of Umbar was dyed red with the blood of the slain barbarians. Thus in this cruel fashion did the White Throne come into possession of Umbar for the second time in history. This time, however, Gondor was weaker, and although Telumehtar, now hailed as Umbardacil, that is, Umbar victor, had scored his great victory, it was only shakily held. For one thing, unlike that of Ernil the Seafarer, the king's conquest did not extend deep into Umbar's hinterland. He controlled only the port itself and a thin ring of territory immediately around it. This left the haven vulnerable to easy assault by the barbarian inhabitants living in the surrounding regions, and these lay beyond Telumehtar's means to subjugate. This meant an interminable series of defensive skirmishes, assaults, and counter-assaults in and around the environs of the city, which merely served to drain Gondor's only tenuously regained strength and resources. It is perhaps useful at this point to make some mention of Gondor's population over the years. At the end of the War of the Last Alliance, it is thought that the realm contained some 2 million souls. That number had doubled by the time of the Easterling invasion some 5 centuries later. By the death of Siriondil in 830, the number had doubled again to something like 8 millions, and by the time Atanatar Alcarine died in 1226, the Seven Heartlands numbers may have peaked at 15 or even 17 millions. Then came the decline. By the death of Eldacar, the population had reduced to 10 millions, and by the accession of Tarandor in 1636, that had shrunken by nearly half to 5.5 millions. Things had improved somewhat during Tarandor's long and stable reign, so that something close to 6 millions resided in Gondor during the reign of Telumehtar, but it was still a far cry from the numbers she had enjoyed when Umbar had first been taken by Ernil. As they had done in previous centuries, the free Umbardrum tribes frequently joined in alliance with Harad, so that the numbers of the Southrons were further swelled, calling for continual enlargements of the garrison in the city. Even this, however, only served to hold the line against an ever-mounting tide. In 829, and then again in 840, Telumehtar fought them, and both times the Southron forces were defeated. They were costly victories in both men and treasure, though, and did little more than postpone the inevitable massive counterstroke. Perhaps the most pernicious effect of Telumehtar's perennial preoccupation with the south was the reorganization of the troops regarding the realm's other borders. Specifically, in order to supply enough men to maintain the defense of Umbar, the king was forced to transfer several legions of soldiers from the eastern marches of Rovanyan to the former. This left Gondor's eastern border perilously vulnerable to attack, something that would prove fateful indeed a bare generation later. Elsewhere in the Seven Heartlands, life and the business of the kingdom proceeded serenely enough. The king cared little, apparently, for the day-to-day running of the affairs of government, being single-minded in his maintenance of Umbar. Therefore, stewards and ministers largely took responsibility for the management of things, and some onerous taxation to support the southern campaign aside, the munificent policies of Tarandor's day were continued. This was a ponderous sign of things to come. More and more the king's attentions were being taken up with matters of defense and leading Gondor's armies, whilst the stewards stayed at home in Minas Tirith and did the tedious work of administration. So as the years and centuries wore on, did the peoples of the Seven Heartlands slowly become more familiar with the king's chief minister than with the king himself, and the monarch became an increasingly remote figure in their lives. Despite its heavy taxations on the treasury, the reconquest of Umbar proved popular with the people, and Telumehtar Umbardacil was much esteemed by his subjects, who, at any rate, took comfort in the renewed safety from raids from the coasts. Nevertheless, the occupation demanded constant vigilance and circumspection on the part of the king, and like Kiriandil before him, he scarcely ever set foot in Minas Tirith or the royal ward after 1810. On the rare occasions when he was there, however, he took great delight in hunting in the verdant forests of Ithilien, and it was whilst on the chase there that he met his end. In Sulamay of 1850, whilst in pursuit of a monstrous boar, Telumehtar's steed slipped his shoe, sending the monarch plummeting to the ground. He was an elderly man by now, and his injuries were severe enough to have grievously wounded a man of half his years. After lingering for a few weeks, he died in considerable agony after a reign of 52 war-racked years. Telumehtar Umbardacil had been a strong and courageous warrior, and his ventures in the south had indeed brought Gondor considerable glory, something which had been sorely lacking for many centuries since the days of the Ship Kings. Nonetheless, it was a glory that Gondor could ill afford or maintain. Whilst he himself lived, the line was held, barely, and Gondor continued to win all the battles, but Telumehtar's reconquest would not long outlast his death, and though he would not live to see it, his neglect of the northern and eastern borders in favor of the south would all too soon prove nearly fatal to the realm. For one of the greatest enemies in all her long history was at the doorstep.